Good afternoon, everybody, or at least, as is the case for one of our speakers joining us from Los Angeles, good early morning to you as well. We're very glad to welcome you to session 3 in the Indeed International Policy and Practitioners Forum, where we will be discussing evaluation of PCVE strategies and policies. We're joined by two very excellent colleagues and speakers in the field that we're very glad to have with us today. And in just a moment, I'm going to hand over the microphone to them. But first, I'd like to just introduce very briefly. We have with us Annelies Povels. Annelies, I'm sorry if I tortured your last name there. Joining us from the Flemish Peace Institute. And Annelies is a researcher working on violent extremism and terrorism. Prior to joining the Flemish Peace Institute, she conducted research on crime prevention and criminal justice in several international organizations, including the EU Institute for Security Studies, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the UN Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. We also have with us, joining us very early in her time zone, Sidonie Roberts, who's a monitoring and evaluation specialist in global program with the global program on PCVE and global program on PRR at UNOCT. Sidonie has been supporting governments, civil society, and international organizations to use evidence and strategic thinking to improve social outcomes for over 10 years. Prior to joining the UN, she worked in consulting, where she conducted independent evaluations of several large-scale social programs in Australia and supported the development of new government policies and strategies. In her current role at UNOCT, she leads monitoring and evaluation and learning for the global program on preventing and countering violent extremism and the global program on prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration. We're very lucky to also have with us the coordinator of Indeed, Marzena Kodachuk-Wash. And Marzena, I do need to practice on your last name, I know. Marzena has been a pioneer and practitioner in the field, actively coordinating with the Polish Platform for Homeland Security as coordinator of the Indeed project, and is an expert on radicalization and prevention. She has 18 years of experience working for Polish police, with a particular emphasis on the prevention of security threats, including radicalization leading to violent extremism. And Marzena is also a co-chair of the European Commission's Radicalization Awareness Network Police and Law Enforcement Working Group, as well as a member of the steering committee of the RAND Center of Excellence. We're very glad to have everyone with us today. And to begin, Annelies, I'm going to hand to you, and we look forward to your presentation. We'll have presentations and then open up for discussion together. But during the presentations, I'd also like to remind everyone we have the chat room where you can contribute, comment, share your insights, expertise, and experience. And we also have the questions and answers button where you can ask questions throughout the presentations, and the speakers will have the chance to review those and to respond there as well. Annelies, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the introduction, Kai. First, I'll just try to share my screen because I have a presentation.
It's coming through
now.
now.
So you have my presentation all. You can see it. Otherwise, just yell, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
As Kai already mentioned, so I'm a researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute, which is a policy and practice-oriented research institute affiliated with the Flemish Parliament, so in Belgium. I will, so as we are a research institute which is very policy oriented, I will focus my presentation also on the policy makers' perspective. So I will not really focus on how to evaluate specific interventions in the field of PCVE, but I will try to make a little bit the bridge between policymakers and practitioners in particular. So I'll try to make a bit, try to give some ideas for policymakers specifically on how they can assist practitioners on the field in their own interventions and how they can do evaluation of their interventions in the field of PCVE. I will do that basically based on a dual exercise that we conducted in our own institute. So the first exercise is a literature review of PCV action plans. So I think many of you know that PCVE action plans is something that we see quite increasingly, both at the national level, but also at a local level. So authorities have these kind of action plans, which are very, very comprehensive, contain many actions, many measures, all in the field of various aspects of PCVE. So we did a literature review looking at what are the elements and aspects that can make or can break such an action plan. And we focused on 4 specific aspects, and one of them is evaluation, obviously. A second exercise that we conducted is a bit more locally drawn, so specifically from an evaluation that we conducted in our institute of the Flemish action plan itself. So this is an exercise that we concluded in 2020. And this was a study that was commissioned by the Flemish Agency for Home Affairs. So basically, this is the agency in Flanders that overviews and coordinates the action plans in the field of PCVE. Now, in Belgium, we have various regional authorities, and I think they're quite important in the field of PCVE because they're competent over many aspects of the preventive sphere. So, for instance, youth work, social welfare, education, these are all elements that are competency of the regional authorities, such as the Flemish government. Now, a little bit on how we did this evaluation of the action plan. Now, we did not conduct an impact assessment. I will come on back to that point a little bit later again in my presentation. We did an overall evaluation on the policy design of the action plan. So what are the underlying assumptions embedded in the action plan? But we also looked at the concrete policy lines. So the action plan is made of several policy lines, for instance, increasing coordination between various actors or strengthening the local approach. So we looked at these specific policy lines. However, we also looked at a number of specific policy actions and measures. But yet we did not, were not able to conduct an impact assessment for a number of reasons. So methodology used, as you can see on the screen, it was quite a large exercise, also because it was a very big action plan with 62 measures and actions. So we conducted first an analysis of policy documents. We also conducted a review of PCVE literature. But most importantly, I think, were the 60 plus qualitative interviews that we conducted, because we were very keen on hearing from people that were part of the implementation of this action plan. So how do you feel that this action plan is actually contributing to preventing radicalization? So we spoke to various people from various domains, both from the governmental organizations, both from local authorities, from various policy domains, in particular from the youth welfare sector and also the education sector. But we also spoke to civil society organizations and implementers from projects that had received funding in the field of the action plan financing. Now, in my presentation, I will so basically draw lessons from these 2 exercises, and I will make a bridge between these 2. So I'll highlight 4 aspects that I think are crucial, and each time I will refer back. So I will look at crucial elements that we know are important in the field of evaluation of a PCVE action plan. And then I will make the bridge to our own evaluation and see how does this work out or does not work out in practice when you do or do not do these aspects that are so important, as mentioned in the literature on a PCVE action plan. Now, the first basic and main lesson that we see in the literature on PCVE action plans in the field of evaluation is obviously the need to recognize this need for evaluative practices. So policy makers need to recognize the value of evaluation. And this is necessary for a number of reasons. So the first one is obviously the need to strengthen and update policies. I think, for instance, to see where policy is doing well, where policy is not doing well, and for instance, when the situation on the ground is changing, or for instance, violent extremism is a very evolving phenomenon. So that means that your action plan also needs to evolve with that, and you need to do evaluation in order to be able to do that. Obviously, in the field of PCVE, it's also crucial to detect and mitigate possible negative consequences, but also more generally, zooming a bit out from PCVE, for policymakers, it's also crucial to justify allocated personnel and finances, specifically when you talk about an action plan, which obviously contains so many policy domains that are involved, contains so many actions, and often also sees quite a lot of personnel and finances allocated. Now, important lesson as well that we know from literature, this evaluation is necessary in all phases of the process. So not only during the implementation of actions, but also in the development of actions already. Because we know that evaluation works best when it's also already preceded the implementation of an action. And importantly, also it's necessary after implementation of actions. So how did these general lessons work out in the Flemish case? Well, in the Flemish case, I think we can say evaluation was something that was foreseen. So policymakers in Flanders thought that evaluation was an important thing. I think it was foreseen as one of the 62 measures in the action plan. And there was also funding foreseen to do this evaluation. And the evaluation was also aimed at updating the policy. So I think that was a quite important thing that was actually foreseen. The view really was there to look at what implementers of the action plan felt about their role in the action plan, and to try to improve these views. So our evaluation also was taken up in the new action plan, both with regards to the role of how the implementers felt about their own role, but also on the evolving situation on the ground. So, for instance, new elements in the field of extremism, so right-wing extremism, single-issue extremism, but also polarization. That was something that was not really present when the first, or not really a pressing issue when the first action plan was adopted. However, the action plan evaluation was mainly an ex post evaluation. So as I mentioned before, this made it really impossible for us to conduct an impact assessment. So we were asked to do this evaluation once most of the project had already been ongoing for quite a while. So we really did not have any baseline measure to really scientifically go and assess the impact of most of these measures. Another important element that we also highlight is that after implementation, it's important to continue this focus on evaluation, I think. And we saw that this was a bit lacking as well. For instance, we felt that policymakers could have played a bigger role in gathering and disseminating the results of evaluation practices. For instance, we saw that there was a significant risk of results of the various projects of the action plan were getting lost. So I highlighted here, this is a big issue of knowledge management. So how can policymakers make sure that the results that often smaller organizations that do the initiatives on the ground and have quite some results of their actions, that these results do not get lost once the funding ends. So this is a bigger issue that's not only relating to evaluation, I think, but we felt this as well was a big issue in the field of evaluation of the action plan. Now, a second main point or a main focus point in the literature on evaluation in the field of PCV action plans is that objectives are crucial. So objectives form a crucial basis of any evaluation practice. Now, these cannot be just any objectives. They need to be realistic, they need to be measurable, and they need to be clearly defined. Idealistic, these objectives are both referring to the plan as a whole, but also to the policy lines and to the concrete actions. Now, and they should describe short-term outcomes as well as medium-term outcomes. In the Flemish case, we felt that the Flemish action plan set up a number of unrealistic and unmeasurable objectives. So there was a twofold overarching objective in the plan. That was to prevent individuals from radicalizing, and the second one is to detect signals of violent radicalization as early as possible. So obviously that's a very, very broad and general twofold objective, which is very difficult to kind of assess. In the action plan, also, we're lacking concrete measures and actions. They also did the measures and the actions in the plan did also not have clear objectives, and which is with the result that it's quite impossible to assess whether the actions have actually been successful. So, first of all, more broadly, did the action plan really prevent individuals from radicalizing? Well, that's a very broad question, which we cannot really answer. But also, have the objectives of the concrete actions been reached? Very difficult to say. And also, did these actions contribute to the overall goal of the action plan? So preventing people from radicalizing, it's very difficult to draw the line there and make assumptions there. And then again, if we cannot answer these questions, it's quite impossible to adjust the policy or to even justify allocated personnel and finances in the field of this action plan. A third main guiding principle from literature on PCVE action plans is the need for an evaluation framework, which is necessary to guide evaluation practices. So that means that there is need to formulate evaluation criteria and standards of performance. A framework that identifies indicators for measuring the success of specific actions and measures. And this is needed to guide both engaged actors and the project implementers, but also to track their progress of these interventions, to progress towards the overall goal of the plan. Making the bridge from these more theoretical aspects in literature to our own practical, the implementation and in our own practical work, we saw that in the Flemish Action Plan, there were no evaluation guidelines. And that meant that in practice, evaluation was approached quite differently by implementing partners. So, as I mentioned, the Flemish Action Plan foresaw financing to various project implementers, and we saw that a number of them adopted systematic evaluation to their projects. Others did a limited type of evaluation, so they did some kind of evaluation. However, others did no focus on evaluation at all. So it was quite differently approached. It was left to implementers themselves to see whether they would do evaluation, and if they would do it, how they would do it as well. So I think this is a complicated task, obviously, for policymakers than holding these stakeholders accountable. So how can you know if you have spent your money well? and it's also quite difficult to kind of objectively to go and decide which project should be extended, which project maybe should be terminated, or if there is some project that should be adjusted. Now, I'm coming to my fourth and my final guiding principle from this PCVE action plan literature. Evaluation should be a combined effort. So there's various people that could be involved in evaluation of PCVE actions. So who actually could be responsible for evaluation? It's a question that I'm asked quite often. So first of all, obviously, when we talk about projects, the project implementers obviously play an important role in the evaluation of specific interventions and measures. And this can be, for instance, very like impact assessment or just a process assessment of their interventions. But they're not alone, obviously, because policymakers, I think, also have a significant role to play in supporting and guiding these project implementers. They play a role also in coordinating the evaluation practices and, as I mentioned before already, in disseminating the results of these projects. But then again, there might also be a role for third actors, as evaluation often is expertise work. So monitoring and evaluation is something that can be quite difficult, can be something that also may require a specialist assistance. So policymakers may also want to reach out to experts, to scientists that are really experts in this field to conduct adequate impact assessments of this type of projects. Now, back to the Flemish action plan, so our own case study. So responsibility for evaluation mainly was laid with the implementing partners of the Flemish action plan, meaning so the partners that received funding from the government, so they were left themselves to decide whether and how they would conduct evaluation. Now, this could be quite tricky, as I mentioned before. These were often quite, like we say, grassroots organizations, and we saw that many of them lacked the capacity to evaluate their own working. So importantly, I would say they were quite interested in evaluating the working, so there was not a lack of willingness to do so, but there was more of a lack of capacity and also a bit of a lack of feeling certain of, am I doing this right, or do we really know how to conduct a proper assessment of our own working? Another important aspect that I wanted to highlight as well is that we felt in our interviews that there were quite some frustrations as well about evaluation requirements. So that there should be no distance between the requirements about evaluations in the field of evaluations, that they should not be too distant from local practice, because some things, some projects that are implemented on the ground cannot be measured with always complete and hard figures. So we felt that the people in these organizations felt quite frustrated if there was a need to show a kind of evaluation in this kind of field. So I'll keep it at this. These are just 4 points, and I think it was just mainly the goal to kind of stir some discussion. If there's more questions, there's a lot of material also on our website, but I'm also here obviously for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annelies. Very rich and very hands-on practical sharing from that experience of the evaluation in the Flemish context. Thank you so much for that. I look forward to our diving into and discussing these issues together in the group that we have joining us in the session. What I'm going to do first, though, is to invite Sidonie, if you could share with us your presentation, and then we will come together and discuss the issues that are raised through both of them. Annelies, thank you so much, and Sidonie, handing over to you.
Sure, thanks, Kai. I'll just get my presentation up on the screen. Okay, so it's up. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this session. It's really wonderful to be here. My name is Sidoni, and I've been supporting organizations now for about 10 years to use evidence and strategic thinking to influence social outcomes. I currently lead all aspects of M&E for 2 of UNOCT, so the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism's global programs, and those are the Global Program on Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism and the Global Program on Prosecution, Rehabilitation and Reintegration. I've been in this role for about 2 years, and previously to this I worked in Australia, which is where I'm originally from, in a consulting company that specialized in conducting social research, conducting independent evaluations, and also developing evidence-based policies and strategies. So in that role, in that previous role, I worked with various government departments and NGOs in Australia to help them use evidence to inform their decision-making. And of particular note and kind of relevance to this session, I worked very closely with the New South Wales government, which is one of Australia's state governments, to set up an M&E system for the statewide PCVE portfolio. So I'm very excited to be contributing to the discussion today. I hope I can share as many learnings as possible from both of the roles that I've held. And you can see here on the first slide, I've said it's all in the planning. I'm very, very passionate about helping organizations and individuals to really plan for evaluation, because what I've seen in my experience is that if you get the planning right and you set up the system, what people typically think of as the actual evaluation work, which is the data collection, the analysis, the reporting, that work actually flows really easily if you get the upfront planning in place and done right. Unfortunately, you probably know from your experience as well that a lot of organizations tend to skip the planning or forget the planning, or maybe the planning comes a little bit later down the track rather than happening upfront when, for example, a PCVE policy or strategy is being designed. And that can cause everything to fall over. It can result in challenges. So the planning aspect is really where I'm going to be focusing my insights and learnings today. And just to very briefly flag kind of how I'm going to structure the discussion, I thought I would just very briefly highlight what I see as some of the key challenges in this area of practice of evaluating PCVE policies and strategies. More importantly, and this is where I want to spend most of the time, I'm going to introduce what I see as some of the key solutions to the challenges. And then finally, I thought I would just round off by letting you know what's next for UNOCT's global program on PCVE with regards to the capacity building work that we're doing in this evaluation of PCVE policies and strategies space. Okay, so we all know that in counterterrorism and in preventing and countering violent extremism, there are many, many challenges for evaluation. I actually think it's one of the most difficult policy areas to engage in evaluation. And those things include limitations to measuring intangible outcomes like social cohesion, as well as the inability to measure the absence of something, for example, a terrorist attack. Also, access to sensitive government data can be a challenge. These are some of the general challenges, and I'm sure these will be highlighted in many of the sessions over the next couple of days. But when we're looking at evaluating PCVE policies and strategies specifically, in my experience, I've seen that there are 2 very specific challenges that organizations tend to struggle with. The first one is the lack of an enabling environment for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL, as I will refer to it throughout the rest of my presentation. And what I'm referring to here is a situation where MEL can't actually happen the way it needs to because the organizational or institutional level hasn't fully embraced it, or MEL isn't fully understood at that level, and it's not fully integrated or supported. And the second challenge in this space is that the whole of government and whole of society nature of PCVE means that MEL in this space actually requires a lot of coordination. So when I say whole of government, what I mean by that is that typically, and actually in line with best practice, a PCVE policy or strategy should and will involve several government entities. So that could include departments of justice, health, education, social affairs, etc. And when I say whole of society, what I mean by that is that typically, and again, in line with best practice, a PCVE policy or strategy will involve several non-government actors, such as CSOs, young people, media organizations, the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. So what this means is that there are a lot of stakeholders typically involved in delivering on a PCVE policy or strategy. And the more stakeholders you have involved in delivery, the more stakeholders you need to coordinate with and also rely on when it comes to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So I've outlined these challenges purely for framing purposes, but I really want to spend the rest of my time today providing as many solutions and ideas as I can to address these challenges. UNOCT has recently published a MEL toolkit to support action plans to prevent and counter violent extremism. You're welcome to scan this QR code here if you'd like to access the toolkit on your phone. Otherwise, I'll also drop the link to the toolkit in the chat when I'm finished speaking. So where this comes from is that in 2015, the UN Secretary General released the United Nations Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism. And one of the key recommendations of that plan was for national governments and regional organizations to develop their own national and regional PCVE action plans. So it's been about 8 years now since that strong suggestion was made by the UN Secretary General. Over that time, a lot of UN entities have been supporting UN member states to actually go about developing these plans. But in our work doing that, what we've heard from many governments and regional organizations is that they're still a little unclear how to actually measure and report on the results of their PCVE action plans, and also how to identify strengths and opportunities for improvement to inform future updates to their action plans. So that's actually why we created this toolkit, because we kept getting requests from member states who we were supporting to develop their PCVE action plans to actually do the MEL aspect. So although this toolkit specifically references PCVE action plans in the context I've just described, with the requests from the UN Secretary General, this toolkit is absolutely transferable to PCVE policies and strategies more broadly. And that could also include conducting MEL for PCVE policies and strategies at a state level, at a local level, and even in the civil society context. So in the toolkit, we outlined 3 phases of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and 9 key steps. You can see those here on the screen. So we have phase 1, which is planning for MEL, phase 2, which is the actual monitoring and evaluating, and then phase 3, which is learning from and communicating the results. Although the phases look relatively equal in terms of how they're distributed here in this diagram, there is a lot of focus in the toolkit placed on the planning phase for the reasons that I described at the beginning of my presentation. And today I'm going to cover some of the tips and tricks that we outlined under the 2 steps here that I've highlighted in orange, which are steps 1 and 3, So step 1 is about creating an enabling environment for MEL, and step 3 is about planning to monitor progress. And the reason I'm going to focus on these two is because they directly respond to the 2 challenges that I highlighted previously in my presentation. Okay, so we'll start with step 1 of the toolkit, which is to create an enabling environment for MEL. So creating an enabling environment for MEL means having clear answers to the following questions. And in the toolkit, we've outlined 6 question areas. The first one is about drivers. So if you're about to embark on an evaluation journey for your PCVE policy or strategy, you really need to understand and get clear on why would you like to conduct MEL for that policy or strategy. This is a really critical place to start. We need to know what it is we're trying to achieve with MEL. Is it a top-down requirement? Is it a bottom-up request coming from those who are implementing the PCVE policy or strategy? Is it mostly about demonstrating accountability? Is it mostly about learning for continuous improvement? Is it a combination of the 2? If so, to what extent are accountability and continuous improvement the primary reason? Then as an extension of drivers, we also need to know who the audience for the evaluation is. So I always like to think ahead to when the evaluation report, if you, for example, decide to conduct a final evaluation of a PCVE policy or strategy, when that report is in your hands, who is that report going to be provided to? And what decisions will be informed based on the person that's going to be reading it? Then we have timing. So at what critical points do you need insights into your PCVE policy or strategy's performance? Is there a budget review coming up? Are you wanting to update your policy or strategy next year? Evaluation needs to be really useful for these purposes, whatever the purposes are. So timing is a really important factor to consider. Okay, then we have capacity. So if you're about to embark on an evaluation journey, you need to ask yourself, do you have evaluation skills and expertise internally that you can draw upon? If not, how are you going to bring in those skills? It could be about hiring someone. It could be about bringing in an external evaluation specialist. Whatever the model is, evaluation, there needs to be capacity to lead evaluation within an organization. Then we have budget. So have you set aside a budget for MEL? There's a benchmark that's often used in evaluation, which is that you should set aside between 3 and 10% of the budget for the delivery of an intervention for MEL purposes. Now, obviously, in the case of a single program, that's quite easy to figure out. You have your program budget, and then you just take a percentage of that and set it aside for MEL. When you're planning for MEL for a whole policy or strategy, it becomes a little bit more complicated. What I would suggest doing in this scenario is looking at the aggregate budget for all of the initiatives that sit under a policy or strategy and working out the 3 to 10% for MEL from there. What I've also done before myself when working in contexts where there was some budget set aside for MEL, but maybe not the ideal amount, was to work back from what was budgeted and then to figure out how that money can be most strategically spent. So, for example, when I was working with the New South Wales government to plan for the evaluation of their PCVE portfolio, statewide portfolio, we looked across all the initiatives that were contained within that portfolio, and we looked at which initiatives really needed the most support with monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and that's where we allocated the MEL budget to use it, most effectively. And finally, governance. So MEL requires a big time investment. It requires a lot of effort, especially in the planning phases. So you really need to get clear on who is going to be responsible for developing the monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan for your PCVE policy or strategy. Who is going to be responsible for implementing that monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan on an ongoing basis? Because MEL isn't something that you can just kind of dip into at the start and then dip into at the end. It's something that ideally, needs to have a continuous focus throughout the life cycle of a PCVE policy and strategy. And then it's also really important to ask what other stakeholders need to be involved. And this is where you really need to think again about the range of stakeholders involved in delivering on the policy or strategy, because they also need to be involved in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning aspects, not just the PCVE policy or strategy itself. Okay. So now I'm going to touch on step 3 of the toolkit, which is to plan to monitor progress. And this is in response to the challenge I identified earlier around coordination when you're working in a whole of government and whole of society context. In the toolkit, we have suggested 3 key strategies to establish a successful coordination of MEL. Those are to appoint a manager to coordinate the policy or strategy and its monitoring, evaluation, and learning aspects. So ideally, we want monitoring, evaluation, and learning to be integrated into the overall management of the PCVE policy or strategy. We've seen this done really well in a couple of contexts, or I've seen it done really well in a couple of contexts, specifically in Australia and also in Kenya. And within the toolkit, you'll see we've provided 2 case studies inspired by these approaches to hopefully give you a sense of how this can be achieved. We also suggest establishing a working group to oversee the policy or strategy and its monitoring, evaluation, and learning again. So this is a way to make sure that all the relevant stakeholder organizations are on board with monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And in the toolkit, to help you see how you can integrate monitoring, evaluation, and learning into this framework of using a working group, we've actually provided an example terms of reference for a working group, as well as an example working group meeting agenda that integrate MEL aspects. So this should hopefully help you to see how MEL can be integrated into that kind of forum. And finally, we suggest really focusing on enabling MEL at the initiative level. So let me just outline what I mean by the initiative level, because I know this terminology can be a little bit confusing. So as you can see here in this diagram, a PCVE action plan, in the case of this toolkit, or more broadly, a PCVE policy or strategy, will generally have a set of overarching objectives. So you can see these here, objective 1, 2, and 3 in the medium blue color. And these are the objectives that the evaluation, if you're conducting a final evaluation, will typically seek to measure achievement under. Under those objectives, you'll typically have multiple initiatives that will be contributing to each of those objectives. And this is really where most of your data collection will actually take place. So this is why it's absolutely critical to make sure that the initiatives that are actually sitting under a PCVE policy or strategy are set up to collect data that will feed into the assessment of performance at the whole of policy or strategy level. So we have in the toolkit, from our experience doing this ourselves, outlined some key strategies to enable monitoring at that initiative level. We have talked about establishing clear expectations that organizations delivering initiatives under a PCVE policy or strategy will actually undertake monitoring and evaluation and learning at their initiative level. So you have to think about what this means in your specific context, what levers you can pull, and what's going to be, I guess, culturally appropriate. But for example, in the Australian context, the funding for PCVE initiatives or programs or projects typically is distributed at that policy or strategy level. So what this does is it allows the central government agency who's coordinating the PCVE policy or strategy and distributing the funding for the initiatives under the policy or strategy to actually include requirements in funding agreements for the organizations receiving funding to actually require them to conduct monitoring, evaluation, and learning at that initiative level. But while requirements are great, they're a great lever to pull, it's also important to recognize that if organizations don't have the capacity to conduct MEL, everything can still fall over. So if you're responsible for coordinating a PCVE policy or strategy, you really need to be assessing monitoring, evaluation, and learning capacity at that initiative level, and also thinking about how you can best support those initiatives to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So, for example, you may need to provide them with some funding to hire a monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialist to help them plan for monitoring, evaluation, and learning at the initiative level. This is really, really, really important. And this has been done really well by the New South Wales government. So I'm happy to talk to this further in our discussion if it's interesting to people who are in this session. And then finally, it's really important to set up a data management system for a PCVE policy or strategy, because if you have 20 initiatives sitting under that policy or strategy, and you're going to be asking them to send you lots of data, performance data, you need to have a way to store that over time. So again, this is going to be very context specific, but it could include things like setting up standard reporting templates, having a spreadsheet where everyone inputs their data, or even some of the more sophisticated approaches, which can include using some kind of software to manage and store this kind of performance data. So I wish I had time to share more of the toolkit content with you. It's quite a comprehensive toolkit. There's also a really helpful 4-step process to actually help people who are managing PCVE policies and strategies to figure out what how they need to measure the success of their policy or strategy. But just given the time we have today, I decided not to delve into that aspect of the toolkit. But just before I close off, I just wanted to very briefly let you know what is next for UNOCT's global program on PCVE in our MEL capacity building space. So end of this year, start of next year, we're going to be working really closely with the government of Kenya to support them to plan for MEL for their new national strategy on PCVE. So this is happening through the EU-UN Threats Facility, which is an EU-funded initiative. So we're really looking forward to getting started on that. We're also going to be developing a set of training modules based on the toolkit content that I've just presented, and we'll be looking to deliver those that training to different audiences in this quite kind of niche area of evaluation, of evaluating PCVE policies and strategies. So please do get in touch if you're interested in either participating in that training or potentially funding the training to be delivered. And finally, we are also working at the moment on a second monitoring, evaluation, and learning toolkit, which will be about supporting practitioners who are delivering PCVE strategic communication campaigns to measure their performance. So the global program on PCVE delivers a lot of capacity building in this area. So for example, in combating hate speech, and every time we deliver this training, we get requests from participants in the training to actually understand how to measure the performance of the campaigns that we're helping them to build. So we're proactively responding to that need as well in this kind of second niche area of evaluation. So looking forward to also being able to release that toolkit. That's everything from me. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the following email address, or you can also get in touch with me directly, and I'd be happy to talk with you further. Thank you.
Sidonie, thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant and so rich in detailed presentation. You touched upon so many aspects for people working practically in evaluation and working in PVE, CVE that we could go into a very rich discussion together. And that's what I would like to invite all of us to now. So just to share for Annelies and Sidonie, there is the function on AirMeet where you'll see a button on the screen with the Q&A. And some participants have been asking specific questions there. I will also share some of them out loud to all of us, and you have the opportunity to look at the questions there and give answers to them as well. Also, for everyone with us in the session, if you would like to make a contribution or to speak, and ask a question directly or share briefly your experience, you can also put your hand up, and Patrick, who's with us on technical support, will then try to authorize to enable people to speak so we can really have a conversation together. I was writing extensively through both your presentations, Annelies and Sidonie, and I have about 20 questions or points I'd love to take up here with you. But first, let's turn to some of those that were asked in the questions and answers. With Raul, we have a question. Is the methodology that you used available, the literature which was reviewed and the qualitative analysis approach used? Annelies, that was during your presentation. So is the methodology that you used in doing the evaluation available? A second question also from Raul was, does or should the action plan come first or the envisioned evaluation approach for the project? How early should tackling the evaluation come into play? And Sidonie, you were speaking about the need to plan, and emphasizing that right from the beginning. So maybe we could start with those two questions and invite both of your thoughts. One about the evaluation, the methodologies that are being used in these evaluations of national action plans. And the second, what should come first, the action plan or the evaluation approach? And how early do we begin tackling evaluation when looking at PCVE strategies, policies, action plans, and programming and interventions? Who wants to dive in first?
If I may, I can say something about the methodology used in our project. Unfortunately, we have a whole book about it, but it's in Dutch, so it's only going to be for Dutch speakers. Unfortunately, I can say something more about it though. So basically, because it's such a wide action plan that we evaluated, we basically did it according to two evaluation criteria. That's the way how we practically managed it. The first one is adequateness, and the second one is effectiveness. So meaning with adequateness, we meant, basically we said, does the policy provide relevant solutions to the problems? That's how we basically put it into practice. And effectiveness meant, so does the policy measure actually contribute to achieving certain objectives? So this is a bit shortly said how we the criteria along which we evaluated the action plan, but we kind of subdivided it in 5 sub areas basically. So what we first did was a big transversal scan, we called it, of the whole action plan. We looked for major underlying assumptions in the whole plan and see if we could find them back in literature. So things that they were highlighting as, okay, this is crucial to counter or prevent radicalization. Then we were checking out, can we find it back in PCVE literature? And then we basically looked at the main areas that they highlighted as crucial, which were youth work, education sector, and the local approach. And the 5th element was basically looking at the evolving scene of violent extremism with the question, is the current action plan still adequate enough and efficient enough to deal with the current situation of violent extremism? So very quickly, we used a mix of qualitative methods, including both survey to, for instance, local authorities, the focus groups we did as well. We did qualitative interviews with one-on-one with people. So yeah, really, it was a very, I would say it, a cooperative work with a lot of researchers. But unfortunately, the only things we really have in English is the one I have on my slide there, the last slide. It's specifically on the education sector. So how they felt that their role in the whole action plan was going. As well as the paper on the whole of society approach. That's also on the last slide.
Thank you, Annelies. Sidonie, please.
Sure. I'm happy to talk a little bit to the second question, which was around kind of which comes first, policy or strategy, or the MEL plan or strategy. I mean, ideally, they should come at a hand in hand, no? Or at least the evaluation strategy should very quickly follow the development of the policy or strategy. But actually, I would say evaluative thinking can actually really help to inform the development of a policy or strategy itself, because what evaluation does and what evaluative thinking does is helps people who maybe don't have that so much of an evaluative mindset to think about whether the objectives they're setting in that policy or strategy are actually measurable. And so it can be really valuable actually to have some evaluative thinkers involved in that process of developing the policy or strategy itself. And then that just means that the policy or strategy is set up right from the start, it's measurable, and the actual evaluation plan can flow very easily. But I always feel a little bit, I guess, reticent to say that as well, only because it's never too late to evaluate. If you already have a PCVE policy or strategy in place, there's still scope to set up a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. So I just also don't like to discourage people that they feel like they've missed the boat and now they can't do any evaluation. That's definitely not the case. But obviously, if you're looking to the future, ideally you want to be doing the two things at the same time.
Please, Annelies.
Yeah, if I may, I would just like to say something about that as well. I think that I fully agree with that. I think it's often evaluation is seen as something that is a burden. I think it should be the opposite way, because I think that evaluation is something that can help you actually set up your own action plan. As you make an action plan, there's so many ways that you want to look at preventing and countering violent extremism, so many measures. But while you're trying to pinpoint them out, I think thinking about how you're going to evaluate actually is a way to concretize them. So it should, I think, for instance, when you want to work on online radicalization, that's one of the main, measures or actions. When you think about how are we going to evaluate that, it's also a way of thinking, okay, let's make it more concrete. Are we going to do this in a primary prevention mode? Is it going to be secondary or tertiary prevention? So it really is a way of, for yourself, I think, as a government, make it more concrete, because otherwise your action plan is not really going anywhere. It's just an empty sentence without really, having a goal or objective. So it's not a burden. It's something that should help you, I think.
I'd love to connect with some of the points that you were making just there now. One of them for me, which stands out often, is when we speak about ideally in the field, that ideally it should start from the beginning. And one area that we're trying to engage with is to move us away from talking about things that should be fundamental good practice and calling it ideal. Because I would suggest it's not ideal. It's that we need to begin to learn how to do it in practice, because if we don't begin planning for it and building in for it at the planning and design phase of our policies and strategies and interventions, then it becomes much more difficult, not only simply to do evaluation and to gather the data that we need for it, but also to actually design good policies and interventions. And this idea that you mentioned, which I think is a term many of us use in the field and beginning to come out more broadly, evaluative thinking. And Annelies, where you highlighted that it's often seen as a burden, and instead we should actually be seeing this as an instrument, a tool that we have as practitioners and policymakers in the field to really understand what's working, what isn't working, how and why. And if we're sincere, if we're really honest about wanting to address these challenges and these issues that are facing our societies, then really wanting, as policymakers, as practitioners, as people in the field, to understand if what we're doing is working or not, and how and why, and what can we do to make it better. To that extent, one of the things that you both spoke about a few times was the issue of capacity. And that's come up in some of the questions as well. And capacity at many levels. So one, donors often don't provide budgeting to be able to implement evaluation. You mentioned that there were cases where organizations might want their work evaluated, but they may not know how. Within the Indeed project, we carried out consultations in smart hubs in 17 countries across the European Union. And one of the feedbacks that we received is, at the national level, in almost every country in the European Union, practitioners, be they from law enforcement agencies, social services, NGOs, or others, none of them have ever had any training on evaluation. When you look at the professional formation of police officers, social workers, NGOs, they may be trained or have very minimal exposure on what are drivers and factors of violent extremism. Sometimes, rarely, they may have received some training on different approaches to addressing it. But in an assessment of what is done in 17 EU member states, none of them had any components in their curricula, and both at the professional level and also at university level, in understanding what is evaluation and how does it fit in. So there's funding capacity, there's capacity in terms of knowledge and competence. You spoke about the enabling environment, which also reaches another point, time. People are often so busy doing what they're doing and then already doing the next projects and the next initiatives, when, if an evaluation is done, over 90% of them are still summative or final evaluations. So people have already moved on. I wonder if I could ask you to speak a bit to these, what you may have seen, the capacity challenges in the field to actually be doing evaluation and doing evaluation well.
Annalise, is it okay if I start on this one? Yeah. Okay. So something I am quite passionate about is building internal evaluation capacity and also self-evaluation. I think Kai, you and I have talked a little bit about this recently, the other day, that we often put independent evaluation reports on a pedestal. And I used to do independent evaluations, so don't get me wrong. I agree there's a very important place for independent evaluations, but those happen, once every 6 months, once a year, if you're lucky. And what happens in the interim, in the middle of that time? So I think we often forget about monitoring and we often forget about learning. And that's, I think, why a lot of people are now referring to MEL instead of M&E, because that learning aspect is, people are really trying to highlight that learning aspect more. So something that I've seen work really well in terms of building evaluation capacity is actually having someone embedded in a team, an organization, that can actually support internally and help to I guess in some cases take some of the stress out of evaluation. Kai, you mentioned that people, program managers, for example, are usually very busy and they feel like they just have to get on to the next project and the next activity. So in some cases, it's about kind of helping those program managers feel like they have some support, but also helping them learn by doing. So not just having that person, that internal evaluation expert do everything, but actually working hand in hand with program managers so that they can learn by doing a little bit as well. So I've seen this done really well in the New South Wales government context, which, just as a reminder again, is one of the state governments of Australia. Australia has a federal political system. In the New South Wales government, the PCVE portfolio is coordinated by one central government agency. There's a small team of about 10 people who are actually responsible for coordinating that portfolio, and one of those people is an evaluation person. And that person works basically with there's about 25 initiatives that sit within the PCVE portfolio, and that person works with all of the initiatives to make sure that they have an M&E plan or MEL plan in place that is going to appropriately feed into that assessment of performance at the whole of portfolio level. And that's been a huge enabler for the New South Wales government in terms of being able to learn on an ongoing basis, because they also have working group meetings where they come together about once a quarter and share learnings from across all the different initiatives. But it also means that when they come to do their independent evaluation, which in this case they plan to do kind of 2 to 3 years down the track, there's already a whole lot of data that's been collected by the initiatives that can be used by that independent evaluator coming in to actually assess the performance at that whole of portfolio level. So I've seen that approach work really well. It's just one person, but it can have such a big impact in terms of helping people to feel supported and like evaluation is achievable and not overwhelming, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Simone. Annelies?
Yeah, I think also in the Flemish case, we have some good lessons, I think, that I can share. One of them is one project that was financed by the government, basically, that was subdivided, I think, in 7 specific projects. I think 6 of them were basically implementation projects, so really focusing on a specific goal, a specific project. And the 7th one was really focusing on evaluating these 6 projects. So it was a combined effort. So I think that's a good way also to make sure that, the connections are made between those who don't have the expertise and then the 7th project implementator, basically, that were academic institutions that were really experts in evaluating. So I think a lot of that can also be done by just connecting people, networking expertise. So policymakers can also just facilitate this kind of networking. It doesn't need always to cost a lot of money or time. It is something that you can also just set in place when you have an action plan and you have funding to give to project implementers. You can also just make sure that people come to an event and ask them to kind of, be informed. It's something, I think there are ways possible that do not necessarily have to cost a lot of money. I think a lot of the project implementers really want to evaluate and try to do that already on a regular basis. But sometimes they get a bit paralyzed, I think, when you come with big words like, external evaluation. Well, actually, internally in their own organization, they also want to do that. So it's about connecting people, I think, often.
Annelies, thank you so much for those. And this is one of the reflections or areas where we need to improve practice that we would actually put back out to all of the participants in this session. For many decades in evaluation, we had a drastic misconception where we thought that evaluation was well done or best done by academics and experts coming from universities, because we had a social prejudice, a knowledge prejudice, where we thought that it's in universities that you have knowledge and that you have expertise. And we developed a fundamentally defunct model and approach to evaluation over the last nearly 50 years in the development field and many others, and then lately copied into the PVE, CVE field, where we would bring people who sometimes had absolutely no operational knowledge or experience or had ever had any work on the ground to be doing evaluations of things they had no background and understanding of, and thinking that you could apply purely quantitative and sometimes qualitative approaches to making sense of it. But if I've never worked on that area, I may not know what questions to ask. I may not even realize when an insight of such profound significance is shared because I don't assign importance to that. And in fact, so many of the evaluations we have provide very little substantive knowledge and learning to the field because of the ignorances or prejudices or the methodologies from which they are approached. And there may be a space for us to begin thinking innovatively about how can we really reflect upon how to do learning. within this field of practice, and perhaps to learn from other areas as well. So there are many fields, including, for example, medicine, which is one of the pioneers in looking at evidence-based evaluation, where there will be times where they hire very expensive expert consultancy agencies or external consultants, but they also have rigorous built-in capacity within their institutions and organizations and practices. So they will do case learning. They will build into work processes, having mentoring and coaching. They use many different instruments which help them to harness and harvest knowledge and experience and question and challenge and innovate in practice. You spoke, Sidonie, and we had discussed a few days before looking at how to build learning tools into our processes and into our institutions. And Elise, you mentioned also workshops and bringing people together. We've seen the pioneering in other areas of practice of developmental evaluation, where you build a team working with the intervention through the process to create reflective spaces and to use evaluation tools so that you're doing real-time learning, which can feed into the further work. This is one of the critical areas where much more needs to be done in the field. I'd like to ask you both about another area, and Sidonie, you mentioned it as the third component, and it's around learning from and communicating from results. And one of the things that has been learned in meta-evaluations of a lot of evaluation practice is that the number of people that read evaluation reports is often 2 to 5. So we sometimes have huge amounts of money that's spent. We produce reports, and that's the way it's done, as reports. And often in a language which is quite inaccessible to people, and a formatting and a style of presentation that is quite inaccessible for people. And what happens is that if we engage with stakeholders and communities, we do surveys, we do interviews, we use different tools to extract information. But at least in the evaluation field, we have never had that conversation, which has come up in many other areas, of challenging colonial practices and challenging extractive practices, where you see practitioners and communities as the sources you take your information from, and then we do our publications and we, advance as expert evaluators, but we have no ethics or accountability of bringing information back to communities and stakeholders with the idea that they should have ownership of it. Practitioners often see evaluation as a threat or a burden, something done to them on top of very busy schedules. And we often do not have mechanisms which plug into the realities of the working context and the needs of practitioners or of evaluators, so that the learning fits and feeds in to their contexts. And there can be many, many ways of doing that. What I'd like to ask you is your reflections on what needs to happen to transform the way we engage with what we could call learning or evidence or discoveries from evaluation, to actually bring it forward perhaps in more relevant ways, or to engage with it better to help inform policy and practice. Sorry, that was a big question. Whoever wants to dive into it, please feel free. And the aim of this forum really is to create a space for us to be engaging and thinking through and talking through together key questions and issues in the field. We don't need to necessarily come up with the answers to it all, but trying to look at, after so many years and decades and so much practice that really has fit almost stuck within some ways, how can we evolve what we're doing? You mentioned moving from M&E to MEL, and some of us also speak about MELI, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, learning, and improvement. And the idea that the only reason we should fundamentally be doing monitoring and evaluation is to actually achieve change, to inform and to feed into our policy and our practice and what we do, either to be able to do better what is working well, to change what isn't working, to discover what we're missing. So utilization and that aspect of accountability, learning, and improvement.
I can say a couple of things if that's okay. It was interesting you mentioned one point, Kai, about evaluation reports. And I think you said, on average, only 2 to 5 people read them. When I worked on producing independent evaluation reports for 8 years prior to this role. And I realized when I moved out of that role and came into this role where now I'm reviewing others' evaluation reports, that I was really lucky actually to work in an organization where the directors that I worked under had very high standards in terms of evaluation reports needing to be digestible, to communicate findings really clearly, to utilize data visualizations really effectively to convey the results. When I moved into this role and started reviewing others' evaluation reports, just being very honest, I was a little bit shocked at the kind of products that people produce sometimes, how undigestible they are, how long they are, just words and words and words and words and words, no thought given to actually the reader who might be wanting to engage with this report. And I honestly feel that we need to raise the bar in terms of these evaluation products that we're producing as evaluators. So I believe that as commissioners of evaluation, we should be incorporating requirements for reports to be really digestible, to utilize data visualization, as I said, but also there's a possibility to have the evaluation report and then to have other accompanying products to the evaluation report. So I'm sure many of you have used this approach already, but the idea that you can have a snapshot of the findings that might be, maybe a 2 to 4 page document that can be distributed more widely and is more likely to be taken up by a range of stakeholders. So it's more likely to be read by, for example, senior leadership, but also it can be used to close the loop. Kai, as you said, often we don't close the loop with those who have given their time, sometimes without any kind of tangible benefit to an evaluation through contributing to interviews or providing data. It's really good practice, and it's really good, ethical to actually close the loop with those people and to provide them a sense of what the findings are that have come out of the evaluation, and so that they can see that their contribution has been worthwhile. So this kind of product, 2 to 4 page snapshot, can really help to inform a lot of different audiences about the results of an evaluation. That's the first thing that I would say. And I've kind of lost my train of thought now, but so maybe I'll just pause there, and then if Annelies has something to say, and I can come back in on some other points.
That would be great. Thank you. Annelies, please.
Yeah, I was thinking more, I think it also kind of perhaps points us to a bit of a deeper issue sometimes, depending on the sectors that are engaged. If I think about the Flemish case that we worked on specifically, I think that we saw quite different results coming from the various sectors that we were focusing on. So in specifically the youth welfare sector versus the education sector, we saw it was very differently how they worked also. So I think it also depends on how these sectors are built up. For instance, I think civil society organizations, but also youth welfare sectors in Belgium, it's much less structured, much less hierarchically organized. It has a less direct line with policymakers than for instance, we saw with the education sector. I think that also something that plays a role. Ultimately, I think it also revolves a little bit about trust, I think, and the lines of that you have towards policymakers. So it's maybe not only about specifically the reports in say, but also the way of communicating the things that you find. And I think that also plays somehow a role. And with trust comes also issues of how you think policymakers or government perceive you as a sector. For instance, we heard some complaints about youth organizations saying, okay, but we have been seeing our funding diminishing for over the last 20 years. So that obviously means that, now we participate in this action plan. We want to also participate in a project in the field of PCVE, meaning that, we get funding, but that is also short-term funding, obviously. Well, if you don't have a structurally funding for your own organization, meaning that you have someone put on that specific project, that project ends, you have specific results, but that remains inside in the organization. If then as a government, you will not invest specifically in extracting these results and drawing them more to the top, you will not have them and you will not be able to share them. But that devolves about that's something deeper. It's about how that sector is lined up with your policy domain. So I think sometimes it's just very complicated, and that depends from one sector to another, I think.
Thank you, Annelies. Sidonie, did you remember or think of further, please?
Yeah, I remembered my second idea, which was around when I presented, I talked a little bit about this idea of establishing a working group to oversee a PCVE policy or strategy and its MEL aspects. And just coming back to that idea, those working group meetings can be an amazing place to share learnings. I talked about the challenge of the whole of government and whole of society context of PCVE policies and strategies, but we could also flip that and say that the beauty of that means that there are such diverse learnings potentially coming from all of the initiatives that sit under a PCVE policy or strategy. And if you have representation in those working group meetings from all of those organizations involved, the richness of those learnings can be so deep. And so that's just, I would say, if you have that kind of working group already set up, that's a great place to share learnings. And then it can also be really good to actually hold dedicated reflection sessions too. I think Annelies mentioned this idea of workshopping findings. If you're having an independent evaluation conducted, it can also help the evaluator in the sense-making process to have a workshop with some of the people who've been implementing interventions to kind of present some initial findings and get their observations and their sense of what it might mean. So that's also something that can work really well. So that was kind of my second point.
One of the special sessions we'll have later today is by Michael Quinn Patton, who is one of the world's leading pioneers and thinkers within the field of evaluation for the last more than 30 years. And he has really worked and written extensively on the area of evaluation facilitation, because many evaluators are much more comfortable behind a screen and looking at numbers. And that can be a very useful and important component. It's not to take away from that, but it certainly isn't a sufficient approach. And what he looks at is evaluation facilitation, how you engage stakeholders, how you earn trust, how you facilitate also spaces and workshops for reflection, for mutual learning, and so that you can have from communities and from stakeholders making sense of and developing that understanding and findings and being able to test and give feedback on them together. There are a lot of great questions, and I want to turn in just a moment to one by Erin Lawlor. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, you spoke, Annelies, about this context where, for example, there's reducing funds. And we're speaking in this session about evaluation of strategies and policies and national action plans. And one question that I have that I'd like to just put out there for your straight thoughts and answers is, to what extent do policymakers actually care? Policy is coming quite often from the field of politics. And we see that we live in a context of very polarized politics, often developing policies and measures which have little or no connection with evidence and actual experience or engagement in listening to communities, but because of ideological programs and agendas. And one thing that evaluators often work with is biases and how bias can influence and impact both the interventions we design, but also the evaluations we do. And policy and politics is an area quite significantly influenced by bias. So when we're doing these evaluations of national action plans, or when we're looking at evaluations of strategies, to what extent do you feel that policymakers and politicians actually engage with, and what can we do? Linking with that, I want to speak to this aspect of us as a field. So we have a field where, as you've each mentioned, practitioners have developed a lot of experience, organizations have developed a lot of experience. But when we did the consultations I mentioned previously in 17 countries across the EU, the very clear feedback we got from practitioners across every single country was that they felt that there was no listening to their experience or expertise, and the accumulated knowledge that developed amongst practitioners and those actually engaging in the field was not turned to and listened to in many cases when it came to developing legislation or policies. So the first question is, are policymakers and politicians interested? The second question is, as a community of practice, what do we need to do to perhaps be, as Tadia Makinen asked us to in the beginning, be a bit more courageous in our work? Are there things we need to do to be more effective or be louder or more innovative in how we work to make sure that policies really reflect what's needed and really reflect the evidence and the learned experience in the field?
It's a very tough question, obviously. I think there's two big issues there, because you say policy and politics. I think they're two different things. So I think politics, obviously, that's a very different issue, very complicated. When we talk about policy, I think that is all a whole matter of issues from its own. No, policy cycle is very complex and differs from one country to another. So I think, especially when we talk about these things like action plans, where all the policy domains obviously are involved, from national to regional to local, so it becomes very complex, and each of these domains have to give their input in an action plan. I think it's quite logic that it also doesn't always go very smoothly. But I don't think that, at least from my experience, we can say that there is no interest in evaluation or knowing whether something works or not. My experience is that the interest is there, at least from my Flemish experience. The interest has always been there. It just becomes very complicated because that's just the way how policy cycle works. Each policy domains has their own way of working, has their own budgeting. So all these things that you have to take into account, I think. But the will to work there is there, I think. Now, I think the question, how can we urge them to work better or focus more on evaluation? I think sometimes it's also about making it more concrete and tangible. That can also something that can already make it work sometimes. When you really point also to how practical it can make their work more easy. That's also something that I found useful in the past. For instance, I in previous discussions with policymakers, I felt that sometimes they have difficulties in engaging some certain sectors in civil society, and you know, in a way that's also logic, because you're talking about the prevention and countering of violent extremism. So certain civil society organizations do not want to be involved in that. But if you engage them from the beginning of the process, when you are starting the action plan, and you have this consultation process with them, also on the field of evaluation, where you tell them, okay, this is how we're going to do it. This is the clear objectives of the action that we want you to do. That's a whole other way than having an action plan and then engaging them and saying, this is where you will be involved. So I think the consultation process is crucial in that, but that starts from the beginning. And that's, again, we're talking about this direct line that you have with all these sectors. It's not something that you do at the last minute. You do it during the whole time. It's something you work on at a structural basis so that you have it when you want to start working on setting up an action plan. Yeah.
Thank you, Annelies. Sidonie.
Yeah, I agree very much with everything Annelies said. I think it's very context specific. It's very challenging. Maybe just to add one very brief comment, to just say that, ultimately politicians want to look good. That's their kind of modus operandi. So, there are cases in which evaluation can help do that by highlighting the successes. If there's been an intervention that's been particularly successful and an evaluation report is able to highlight that, and then, government ministers are able to claim that success as their own, then, that can be potentially advantageous to that particular intervention receiving continued funding. So there are cases in which we can use evaluation to advocate for what's working well to get continued funding. It can be a little bit more awkward when it's the other way around. I once evaluated an intervention that had received funding just purely based on a minister in Australia's personal interests. And after 3 years, it was not really achieving much. And that was quite a difficult report to write. Obviously, we were true to the findings. We highlighted what was not working. But then obviously managing the stakeholder relations around that was a little bit more sensitive. And again, Kai, I think this goes back to what you were saying around what Michael will talk to around how evaluators need to be good facilitators as well. So yeah, that's probably all I can add on that question.
Thank you both so much. We are actually at time. I am just seeing there are many very good questions still. We've touched upon issues raised by many of them in the question answers. Aaron's was on, were there any suggestions from practitioners about what evaluation measurements might be more closely related to their practice? And she was asking towards you, Annelies, from the Flemish study, but perhaps thinking both together, when looking at these evaluation approaches and practices, are there measurements, are there methodologies which you think are important for helping to bring it closer to the needs and the experiences and the context to make it useful for practitioners? What I would like is to invite you, please do, if you wish to speak to that. But also, you've both shared so much with us in a very rich session looking at evaluation of action plans and policies. And I'd like to invite you in your last reflections. We are here as a community of practice. We have people from government institutions, the United Nations, evaluators, practitioners from across the field. If you were drawing upon your experience to look at where do you feel we need to go to get better in how we do this in this field and how to improve evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice, what are some of your thoughts for where we need to be going as a field to do this better? And as Annelies and Sidonie think of that, I would also invite everyone who is with us in the session to please share your thoughts also in the chat from this discussion. Where do you feel we need to go to be doing better in evidence-based evaluation and evidence-based policy and practice? Annelies, Sidonie, whoever wishes to. The question from Aaron on making the practices connect more from practitioners, and if you had input on that, and your own thoughts on where we need to go to make practice in the field better.
I'm wondering a bit, but all the things that were mentioned with all these focus groups and interviews, but I'm not really recalling any specific cases on how it on specific elements on what could be better fixed on evaluation on practices on the ground. So I can't really recall any of that specifically at the moment. I just want to say that I think I remember talks about just organizations doing evaluation. So having that already in their organization, but being a bit overwhelmed with the fact of this new element of prevention and countering of violent extremism. So I remember, for instance, organizations working for a long time on social cohesion in neighborhoods, for instance. So they work a lot on that. But then when they're all of a sudden are involved in a new area, so something that actually is not that much new, but the name is new for them, they all become a bit scared and as if they're all working as they have been doing for 20 years, should all be new. So I'm not sure if I convey what I want to say, but sometimes the wording really matters. Sometimes people on the ground really have a sense of what they are doing as well. So it's a bit of like, giving them a push of, okay, let's hear what you do, how you do it, and let's see if this makes sense. So again, with third actors, with the authorities as well that give the funding. So I think it's a combined effort, but not neglect what is already there on the ground as knowledge. But I can't really say what specific criteria that they would say that work better at the moment. And specifically on how we can do it better, as concluding remarks, I sometimes have the feeling that the field of PCVE, it's a bit, specifically when we talk about PCVE action plans, it's a bit of a copy-paste action sometimes. So we hear a lot of initiatives that are done somewhere, and we talk about good practices, best practice, and let's just, we copy that in a new action plan because we need to do something about that, but we don't really know if it works. So I feel there is a bit of a sense now to change that, a bit more focus on thinking about it. Is it really a good practice or a best practice? But yeah, one specific concrete measure I think would just be think about the objective. What really do you want to change? What really do you want to go? Because a PCV action plan, it's such a broad goal. If you just break it down in specific objectives, I think that's very useful already to just make it a bit more concrete and tangible for something that may be a bit too far-fetched for policymakers or practitioners.
Thank you, Annelies. And Sidonie?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to maybe come in on a couple of final thoughts. I think it's clear from my presentation and my kind of interventions, I'm very passionate about the planning part of evaluation and also the enablement part. I think sometimes as evaluation specialists, we like to make evaluation sound very sophisticated and complicated because I guess we have some ego involved in that. But I honestly believe it's not that complicated when it comes down to it. It just requires some exposure. Most people learn evaluation by doing. These days there are degrees that you can study that also teach you how to do evaluation in a formal sense, but many of us have just learned it by doing it. And so I really strongly believe in the enablement part. I think if people are provided a little bit of support, they can definitely learn how to do it. And even if they aren't going to do evaluation as 100% of their job, they can become an evaluation thinker, and that can make a big difference within an organization, just having people that can think evaluatively. So I think we should be putting, going forward, I think we should be putting a lot of focus on that enablement part, personally. Yeah, and that's probably where I would leave it.
Sidonie and Elise, thank you both so much, both personally and also professionally, on behalf of all of the contributing partners and organizations involved in organizing the Indeed 2023 International Policy and Practitioners Forum. You've shared richly and generously, and it's very much appreciated for everyone who's taking part. We hope that this session has been insightful and helpful for you as colleagues, practitioners, evaluators, experts, and also people that may simply be interested in the field. I really liked that ending thought on enabling. And you've already heard from the work that's being done by Sidonie and colleagues at the United Nations, also by the EU Crime Prevention Network, and indeed also from the Indeed project. We're placing very significant focus on training and capacity building, but we're also focusing through events such as this forum on creating spaces and forums for us to come together, to be sharing, to be learning from each other's experiences, raising gaps and challenges we face in the field, looking at how to make it better together. We'll also be going forward in the forum and in the Indeed project with communities of practice and local smart hubs. And in fact, right now, I'd like to invite everyone, those who are able, to continue with us. Our next session will be a community of practice space, and it's intended not to have speakers, not to have presenters, but simply to facilitate and enable us to discuss and exchange together, to share and hear from each other key highlights from the different sessions and issues we're facing as practitioners and colleagues in the field. Later today at 5:30 Central European time, 5:30 Brussels time, we will have the special session with Michael Quinn Patton, and I really do encourage you, if you can, do make that. It should be a wonderful experience. Share it with friends, colleagues, family, neighbors, and any others who may be interested. Michael is truly a wonderful individual and has really been pioneering in this work for years. Also tomorrow, all the topics we've touched on today and many more in day 2, we have specific case sessions. We have looking at how to deal with inclusion, voice and cultural competency in the field. We have sessions on designing evidence-based practice. We have some of the leading experts across Europe sharing with us on their experiences in evaluation of exit programs, and also hands-on evidence-based evaluation and looking at challenges of working with young people with high complex needs. So much more. We hope that you will join us. For now, thank you very much. I will be switching myself to the community of practice session. I hope we'll see many of you there with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you.